This story was sent to me by Caressa McKnight, and what you see right here in this picture is University of Texas at Austin. Now, this story is going to be like, I guess you can say a throwback story, but it's just going to reveal something about the school itself. Basically, what I'm about to discuss is the practices that the school has been known to do, especially way back in the 50s, in order to keep black people out of the school. Now, I've already skimmed through some of the article. I'm going to read the entire thing, but some of the stuff that I saw in there is not surprising, but it's amazing of the lengths that they would go to keep black students from actually attending the school, or if they were in the school, what they would do to try to get them kicked out of the school or to get them to drop out of the school. So I'm going to go ahead and read this article coming from theatlantic.com. It says, in the summer of 1955, administrators at the University of Texas at Austin had a problem. The U.S. Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education decision handed down the previous year required educational institutions to integrate their classrooms. But the regents overseeing the state university system's flagship campus, the old alumni, who formed the donor base, and the segregationist political forces that pulled the purse strings were all determined to find ways to keep African Americans from stepping foot on campus. UT had no conspicuous block in the schoolhouse door moment. A series of documents in the UT archives, many of them marked confidential, suggest that administration officials took a subtler approach. They adopted a selective admissions policy based around standardized testing, which they knew would suppress the number of African American students that they were forced to admit. Now I'm gonna stop right there. That I've always said that those standardized tests, I always felt those real shaky, like they made those tests for black students at any rate to not seek their full potential. I'm like, what does a standardized test have to really do with anything? Like I've said before, if you remember, Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland had said that students in PG County, which is a predominantly black county, is no way that they could have been passing all of these tests and everything like that. They just can't see the fact that many black students are very intelligent. But he was very quiet. But he wasn't the governor at the time when the whole thing with Montgomery County happened, when they were cheating, and Montgomery County is a predominantly white county. So let me continue. I came across these little discussed records, all but lost to history, while researching my book about the football player Earl Campbell and desegregation. Campbell played at Texas in the mid-1970s, not long after the head coach finally allowed African Americans on the varsity squad. In recent years, the university has tried to reckon it with its past. Confederate statues have been removed, and a portrait of Heman Sweat, the African-American postal worker whose application to the university in the mid-40s led to a Supreme Court decision that presaged Brown, now hangs in the atrium of the law school that sought to bar his entry. Historically, however, the university went to great lengths to perpetuate white supremacy. Today, standardized testing is widely seen as an objective index of merit. In Texas, in the immediate post-Brown era, it seemed to have been used as a bureaucratic cudgel to maintain Jim Crow. Less than 2 weeks after the Brown ruling in May 1954, H.Y. McCown, the university's admissions dean, dashed off a note to the university president with a proposal to keep Negroes out of most classes where there are a large number of girls. We already know what they was thinking about, like what was literally going through their mind when they said that. They did not want what they would see as the quote unquote male Negro to corrupt the mind of the supposedly pristine palm colored woman. If we want to exclude as many Negro undergraduates as possible, McCown wrote, the university should require African American students seeking admissions to undergraduate professional programs to first spend a year taking courses at Prairie View A&M or Texas Southern University's, both HBCUs. Essentially ignoring the thrust of Brown, the regents adopted the proposal. But the gap year solution was only a temporary one. In June 1955, the 4-person Committee on Selective Admissions, composed of senior faculty and high-ranking administrators, argued that if UT loosens the graduate student application process, the university will be in a position to plead that it is acting in good faith to bring an end to segregation, and it should have some bearing with the course in any attempt to postpone the admission levels of Negro students at the undergraduate level. The university had already been forced to integrate the graduate students' ranks after the 1950 Sweatt decision. The committee seemed to have been suggesting that graduate school admissions would act as a fig leaf for obstruction at the undergraduate level. The committee went on to observe that if the 2,700 person freshman class was admitted according to state population proportions, 300 would be black. And it noted that white UT freshmen had significantly higher aptitude test scores than incoming freshmen at 3 Texas black colleges. A standardized test cutoff point of 72 would eliminate about 10% of UT freshmen and about 74% of Negroes, the committee stated in a footnote. Assuming the distributions are representative, this cutting point would tend to result in a maximum of 70 Negroes in the class of 2,700. In a cover letter to the report, committee members included advice that further suggests that they were at the very least mindful of, if not pleased by, the role of standardized testing will play in the admission of black students. We suggest that the president of the university in the near future ask the other state institutions to exchange ideas on the subject and, if possible, to collaborate in the program of testing. In these discussions, the admissions of Negroes will naturally have a prominent place. There are, of course, many reasons a university might impose a testing regime. Until the mid-20th century, UT practiced an open admissions policy, at least for non-black applicants, as the scholar Thomas D. Russell and Dewana Goldstone have explained. But a post-war boom in students, including returning GIs, raised doubts about how long such a big policy could remain tenable. In The Big Test, Nicholas Lemon points out that many large universities in the 1950s adopted the SAT because they aspired to transform themselves into elite research institutions, but UT moved firmly in this direction only when administrators saw an anti-integrationist virtue of testing. University officials, knowing their litigation was likely and under some pressure from the young, more progressive student body, and certain newspapers tried to mask their segregationist impulses, make a virtue out of a necessity. One UT official jotted down at the time of the Supreme Court's original integration order. The note, which can be found on a scrap of paper in UT's chancellor's records in the university archives, is unsigned. Soon after the Committee on Selective Admissions delivered its report, L.D. Haskell, vice president for the developmental services at UT, recommended that the officials use the term guided admissions rather than selective admissions. I believe it is a good choice for public relations, he wrote. The university will point out to some of the difficulties they will have to surmount, and will also reveal to some students that they should not enter the University of Texas. Another college may be better suited to their particular combination of abilities and needs. So basically, it's a way of rejecting them easily without harshly telling them, Negro, you can't come here. In July 1955, the Regents issued a public statement that new admission standards based on testing would be imposed in time for the 1956-57 school year because UT was expecting many more applications for admissions on the undergraduate level. That August, UT President Logan Wilson gave a speech to the Rotary Club of Houston, assuring that a group of included influential alumni that pending desegregation was not prompted by missionary or reformist motives. The notes for Wilson's speech, housed in the UT archives, leave little doubt that the university knew exactly what it was doing. Merely a realistic acceptance of inevitable to avoid legal hassles, sensible compliance with Supreme Court justice decisions. Do not anticipate any great numbers of ends, but to avoid appearing to discriminate against unqualified, have tied it in with selective admissions policy for students without ref to racial origin, etc. I asked university officials about these documents and what they suggest about why UT adopted standardized testing. The historical records make it clear that racism was a primary motivation in UT's decision in the 1950s to begin testing applicants for admission. Other explanations were given at the time as standardized testing took root nationally, and many universities moved away from open admissions to become more selective. But the ugly desire to keep out African American students was a major driver of that policy. So there you go. I'm not done reading, but there it is. I've always said them standardized testings, it was always something shaky about those, but you can see right there that they came up with a standardized testing policy that they would administer to all the students. but they really did it to target the black students. Notice it said only 10% of the students, mainly non-black, pretty much all white, would not get in, but 74% of black people would not. So they set those tests up for a reason. Just like this is no different than when they were doing voting back in that day, where they made the black voters have to do these silly tests and say certain things like, guess how many jelly beans is in the jar and something like that. And that was the only way they would accept your ballot. You know, stuff like that. Let me see, where did I leave off? Okay, it says the officials said the wrongdoings of the past underline the benefits of creating an inclusive environment today. The university's past history of discriminating against African Americans drives us to be leaders today in serving all qualified students. Leonard Moore, vice president of diversity and community engagement at UT Austin, said in a statement, after fighting integration at the Supreme Court in the 1950s, the University of Texas returned in the 2010s to successfully defend the educational benefits of diversity and the use of race and ethnicity as one factor in admissions. Moore was referring to the fraught story of affirmative action at UT in 1996. A federal court struck down UT Law School's affirmative action policy in Hopwood versus Texas for Cheryl Hopwood, one of 4 white students who sued the university alleging they had been discriminated against because the law school gave preferential treatment to people of color. Now, what does that sound like? Doesn't it sound like that chick from a couple years ago? And now that I think about, I forgot what school it was, but it was some school in Texas that she was trying to get into. And I think she tried to sue them for the same thing, but it's just that her test scores were just piss poor. They said the state adapted while preserving some form of affirmative action by guaranteeing admission to all state universities for students who graduate in the top 10% of their Texas high school class. And mind you, this is another white woman who's trying to sue about that. Meanwhile, they are the biggest benefactors of affirmative action. That was actually something that was supposed to be set aside for us, but they got a hold of it, and now they are crying about it. The rule is now limited to the top 6% at UT Austin. It's a sideways form of affirmative action by guaranteeing admissions to students from all corners of the state, including the high schools that are chiefly black or Latino. The law has increased geographic and racial diversity in today's admissions process. Let's see, it says, perhaps there is no such thing. Decades ago, administrations at UT calculated that standardized tests would tamp down the number of African Americans at UT. Now, Blum and his plaintiffs, aiming for a so-called objective approach to admissions, appear to be carrying that torch. Standardized testing's reputation as a purely objective measure remains complicated and perhaps inevitably tainted by this country's legacy of racism. So pretty much what it all boils down to is this. They implemented a standardized test to try to keep black people out of the school. And that's why I've always said that something doesn't seem right about those standardized tests, like those state tests you got to take to go to the next level. So it seems like it started there and then it trickled down, and now a lot of places have them even on a public school level. So when you think of those standardized testing, you could think places like UT Austin for that, because it seems like they were the origin of it all. It could have been before then, but as far as on a learning level, it looks like they kicked it off. And ironically, it's in Texas. Y'all let me know what y'all think about this down in the comments, and I'll talk to you in the next one.